London, 1854. The whispers followed her like a cold draught through the drafty corridors of the Grenville townhouse. Even the servants, normally discreet to a fault, could not contain their curiosity about the mysterious young woman who had arrived under such peculiar circumstances. "She's the daughter of a traitor, I tell you. I heard she was found in a brothel in the East End. The Duke must be desperate, indeed, to consider such a match." Rose Grenville pressed her back against the wall of the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs as the maids' voices faded. She closed her eyes, willing the sting of tears away. 3 weeks in this grand house, and still she was treated as an intruder, a curiosity, a burden, perhaps because she was all three. She straightened her posture and smoothed down her plain grey dress, the finest she owned, yet woefully inadequate for the daughter-in-law of a duke. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, the hems slightly frayed despite her careful mending. Like her fortunes, it had once been respectable, then reduced by circumstance to mere adequacy. "Miss Grenville," the stern voice of Lady Beatrice Barrington, the Duchess of Westmoreland, cut through her thoughts. "You are expected in the blue drawing-room. The dressmaker has arrived for your measurements." Rose curtsied, keeping her gaze lowered. "Yes, Your Grace." "And do try to smile, girl. One would think you were attending a funeral rather than preparing for a wedding." Rose bit her tongue against the bitter retort that rose in her throat. In many ways, her impending marriage felt more like a funeral than a celebration, the death of her dreams, her independence, her hope for a love match. But those luxuries had been forfeit the moment her father's debts had been discovered. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I shall endeavour to appear more grateful." The Duchess sniffed. "See that you do. My son may have been forced into this arrangement, but there is no reason to broadcast your mutual displeasure to all of society." As the Duchess swept away in a rustle of expensive silk, Rose allowed her shoulders to slump momentarily. Zachary Barrington, the Marquess of Thornfield and heir to the Duke of Westmoreland, had made his feelings about their betrothal perfectly clear. He had not visited the townhouse once since the announcement of their engagement 3 weeks prior, choosing instead to remain at his country estate. The message was unmistakable. She was a duty to be fulfilled, not a bride to be courted. And why should he feel differently? Their engagement was nothing but a business transaction arranged by his father to save her family from complete ruin. Her father had gambled away their modest fortune, then drowned himself in the Thames rather than face debtor's prison, leaving Rose and her ailing mother with nothing but creditors at their door. Then the Duke of Westmoreland had appeared with his proposition, marriage to his son in exchange for settling their debts and providing for her mother's care. The choice had been no choice at all. Rose made her way to the blue drawing-room, each step feeling heavier than the last. The dressmaker, a fashionable Frenchwoman with pins clutched between her lips, immediately began circling Rose like a predator assessing its prey. "Turn, mademoiselle," the woman commanded, gesturing impatiently. "I cannot work miracles if you stand there like a statue." Rose obeyed mechanically, turning as instructed, while fabrics were held against her form and measurements were taken with brisk efficiency. The Duchess supervised the proceedings with a critical eye, occasionally making cutting remarks about Rose's figure: too thin, shoulders too square, complexion too sallow from years of worry and work. "We shall have to order at least 6-day dresses, 3 evening gowns, a riding habit, though I doubt you can ride." "I can ride, Your Grace," Rose interjected, then immediately regretted speaking when the Duchess's eyebrows shot up in disapproval at the interruption. "Indeed, well, that is something, at least. My son is an excellent horseman. Perhaps you may find some common ground there, though I wouldn't count on it." The Duchess turned back to the dressmaker. "The wedding gown must be exceptional. White satin, I think, with Brussels lace. My son's bride must at least appear worthy of his station, even if her bloodline is lacking." Rose felt her cheeks burn. "My father was a gentleman, Your Grace." A gentleman who gambled away his daughter's future and took the coward's way out, the Duchess replied coldly. Let us not pretend this match is anything but what it is, a charity that has cost my son his chance at an advantageous marriage. The words cut deeper than any physical blow. Rose had spent the past 3 years caring for her mother, working as a music teacher to the daughters of merchants, when their money began to dwindle, swallowing her pride as their fine possessions were sold one by one. She had done everything within her power to maintain their dignity, to keep their heads above water, and now to be spoken of as though she were some street urchin being elevated beyond her worth. Forgive me, Your Grace, but I did not ask for this arrangement, Rose said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. If your son finds me so objectionable, perhaps we should end this charade before it begins. A terrible silence fell over the room. The dressmaker froze, pins still clutched between her lips, eyes wide with shock. The Duchess rose slowly from her seat, her face a mask of cold fury. You would throw my family's generosity back in our faces. My husband has saved you from the poorhouse, your mother from a pauper's grave, and this is your gratitude. Rose closed her eyes briefly, knowing she had gone too far. Her mother's life depended on this marriage. She could not afford pride, could not afford to speak her mind. She was trapped as surely as if she were in a prison cell. I apologize, Your Grace. The stress of recent events has affected my judgment. The Duchess regarded her for a long moment, then nodded sharply. See that it does not happen again. Now we shall continue with the fittings. The wedding is in 3 weeks, and there is much to be done if you are to be transformed into something resembling a marchioness. Later, alone in her bedchamber, Rose sat at the small writing desk and pennied a letter to her mother, who was now comfortably situated in a cottage on the Westmoreland estate in Kent. She wrote of the weather, of the new books she had discovered in the library, of the flowers beginning to bloom in the garden behind the townhouse. She did not write of the Duchess's cutting remarks, of the servants' whispers, of the terrible loneliness that threatened to consume her. And she certainly did not write of the fear that gripped her heart whenever she thought of meeting her future husband. What if he despised her on sight? What if he was cruel? What if he resented her for the rest of their lives? A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. It was Phillips, the Duchess's lady's maid, her expression as pinched and disapproving as ever. A letter for you, Miss Grenville. Rose accepted the letter with murmured thanks, noting the unfamiliar handwriting and the seal of the Marquess of Thornfield. Her heart began to race as she broke the seal with trembling fingers. Miss Grenville, I shall arrive in London 3 days hence to fulfill my obligation to meet you before our wedding. I trust you understand the nature of our arrangement and harbour no romantic notions. Ours will be a marriage of convenience, nothing more. I shall provide for you as befits your station as my wife, but I expect discretion and dignity in return. I have no desire for a wife, but as duty demands it, we shall both make the best of an unwanted situation. Thornfield. Rose read the letter twice, then set it aside with a strange sense of relief. At least now she knew where she stood. There would be no pretense, no false courtship, no need to wonder about his feelings. Their marriage would be a business arrangement, cold and distant, but honest. It was far better than she had dared hope for. After all, a loveless marriage to a marquis was still preferable to destitution. She had never expected love, not since her father's disgrace had made her untouchable to respectable suitors. At least this way, her mother would be cared for, and she would have security, if not happiness. Rose tucked the letter into her desk drawer and returned to her own letter. She would focus on the practical aspects of her future. She would be the Marchioness of Thornfield and eventually the Duchess of Westmoreland. She would have responsibilities, a household to run, a position in society. It was more than most women in her position could hope for. Love, she reminded herself firmly, was a luxury she could not afford. And if a small part of her heart ached at the thought, well, That was a weakness she would simply have to overcome. 3 days later, Rose stood in the grand entry hall of the Westmoreland townhouse, her palms damp with nervous perspiration despite the coolness of the spring morning. Her new day dress, a modest creation of pale blue silk, felt foreign against her skin, too fine, too expensive for the daughter of a disgraced gentleman. Her dark auburn hair had been styled by the Duchess's maid, swept up into an elegant arrangement that made her neck feel exposed and vulnerable. "Stop fidgeting," the Duchess commanded from beside her. "A lady must appear composed at all times." Rose forced her hands to remain still at her sides, though her heart continued to pound erratically. After weeks of anticipation and dread, she was finally to meet the man who would become her husband in less than a fortnight. The sound of carriage wheels on the cobblestones outside sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. Footsteps in the hallway, the butler's solemn announcement, and then the Marquess of Thornfield. He was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered and imposing in his perfectly tailored dark coat. His features were aristocratic, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, a straight nose, and his eyes, when they finally deigned to glance in her direction, were a startling shade of green, as cold and remote as a winter forest. "Mother," he said, bowing slightly to the Duchess before turning his attention to Rose. There was no warmth in his gaze, only cool assessment, as though she were a horse he was considering purchasing. "Miss Grenville, I presume." Rose curtsied deeply, as she had been instructed. "My lord." "Zachary, at last," the Duchess said, her tone softening slightly. "I was beginning to think you meant to leave all the wedding preparations to me." "I had business to attend to at Thornfield Court," he replied, his voice deep and cultured. "The spring planting cannot wait, even for matrimony." There was an edge to his words that made Rose flinch inwardly. He spoke of their impending marriage as though it were an inconvenience, a distraction from more important matters. Which she supposed it was. "Come through to the drawing-room," the Duchess said. "I shall have tea brought, and you may become acquainted with your bride." The Marquis offered his arm to his mother, pointedly ignoring Rose, who followed behind them like a shadow. In the drawing-room, he positioned himself by the window, as far from Rose as the space would allow, while the Duchess rang for tea. "Miss Grenville has been most cooperative with the wedding preparations," the Duchess said into the strained silence. "The dressmaker has created a trousseau that will not embarrass us at least." "How fortunate," the Marquis replied dryly. Rose kept her gaze fixed on her clasped hands, feeling like an unwanted package that had been delivered to the wrong address. The silence stretched uncomfortably until the tea arrived, providing a momentary distraction. "I shall leave you two to become acquainted," the Duchess announced, rising with a rustle of skirts. "Zachary, do remember your manners. Miss Grenville, mind you don't bore my son with foolish chatter." With that parting admonition, she swept from the room, leaving Rose alone with her future husband. The silence that followed was deafening. "I believe we should establish some ground rules for our arrangement, Miss Grenville," the Marquis said finally, not bothering to look at her as he spoke. "I have no desire for a traditional marriage. Once we are wed, you will be provided with your own suite of rooms. I shall expect you to fulfill your social obligations as my wife, to behave with propriety at all times, and to manage the household efficiently." Rose swallowed hard. "And what of children, my lord?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. "An heir will eventually be necessary, yes. We shall address that particular duty when the time comes." His clinical assessment of their future intimate relations made her cheeks burn with humiliation. This was worse than she had imagined, to be spoken to not as a wife, not even as a companion, but as a brood mare and housekeeper combined. "I understand," she said quietly. "Do you?" He turned to face her fully now, his expression hard. "Do you understand that I never wished to marry, that I am being forced into this union by my father's misguided sense of charity? That your father's debts and disgrace have become my burden to bear?" The words struck like physical blows, but Rose lifted her chin, refusing to cower before him. I understand perfectly, my lord, just as I understand that I never wish to marry a man who clearly despises me for circumstances beyond my control. Yet here we are, both victims of our father's decisions. Her response seemed to surprise him, his eyebrows lifting slightly before his expression hardened once more. Your father was a gambler and a coward who took his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions. Mine is a duke who wishes to see his bloodline continued. There is no comparison. No, Rose agreed, a strange calm settling over her despite the insult to her father's memory. There is not. Your father at least still lives and clearly cares enough for your future to secure you a wife. Mine left me with nothing but debts and a tarnished name. She rose to her feet, suddenly unable to bear his presence a moment longer. If you'll excuse me, my lord, I believe I have a fitting scheduled for my wedding gown. I wouldn't want to inconvenience you further with my unwelcome company. Without waiting for his response, she walked from the room, her back straight, her steps measured, betraying none of the turmoil within. Only when she reached the sanctuary of her bedchamber did she allow the tears to fall, silent and bitter, for the girl who had once dreamed of a love match, of a husband who would look at her with tenderness rather than contempt. That night she wrote a letter to her mother, full of reassurances and half-truths. Yes, she had met the Marquess. Yes, he was handsome and well-mannered. Yes, she believed they would suit well enough. She could not bear to burden her mother, whose health was still fragile, with the reality of her future husband's disdain. The days that followed brought no improvement. The Marquess was rarely present at the townhouse, and when he was, he treated Rose with cool politeness at best, open disinterest at worst. They were never left alone together after that first disastrous meeting. The Duchess, or some other chaperone, always present to fill the silence with meaningless chatter about wedding preparations and society gossip. On the rare occasions when their eyes met across a room, Rose saw nothing in his gaze but resignation and a barely concealed resentment. She began to dread the approaching wedding day, not with the nervousness of a bride, but with the trepidation of a prisoner facing sentencing. 1 week before the wedding, Rose escaped the oppressive atmosphere of the townhouse for a rare moment of solitude in the small garden at the rear of the property. The spring air was warm, the first roses just beginning to bloom, their fragrance a sweet reminder of her childhood home in Hampshire, now lost to her forever. Miss Grenville. She turned at the sound of her name, startled to find the Marquess standing a few paces away, his expression unreadable in the dappled sunlight. My lord, she acknowledged with a small curtsy. I didn't expect to find you here. Evidently, he moved closer, his tall figure casting a shadow across the garden path. I wish to speak with you privately before the wedding. Rose's heart sank. Had he found some new fault with her, some reason to despise her further? Of course, my lord. He seemed uncharacteristically hesitant, his gaze moving past her to the roses climbing the garden wall. I wish to apologize for my behavior during our first meeting. My resentment of this situation led me to speak harshly. The apology was so unexpected that Rose could only stare at him in mute surprise. You were correct, he continued, his voice low. We are both victims of circumstance. I should not have spoken ill of your father, regardless of my feelings about this arrangement. Rose found her voice at last. Thank you, my lord. Your apology is accepted. He nodded once, sharply, as though checking off an unpleasant duty. I have also been considering our future living arrangements. While I still believe separate bedchambers are advisable, it occurs to me that such an arrangement might give rise to gossip. Therefore, I propose that we maintain connecting rooms, at least at the beginning of our marriage, for the sake of appearances. The clinical way he discussed their marital arrangements made Rose's cheeks warm with embarrassment once more. As you wish, my lord. And one more thing. his green eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I believe we should address each other by our given names, at least in private. If we are to convince society that this is a genuine match, a certain degree of familiarity will be necessary." "Yes, Zachary," she said, testing the name cautiously. Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps at hearing his name on her lips. "Rose," he acknowledged, and then, as if the brief moment of connection made him uncomfortable, he stepped back. "I shall be returning to Thornfield Court tomorrow to see to some business matters before the wedding. I will meet you at the church on Saturday." And with that, he was gone, leaving Rose to wonder at the strange encounter. His apology had been unexpected, a small crack in the wall of his hostility. But it changed nothing about their fundamental situation. Theirs would still be a marriage without affection, a business arrangement dressed up in wedding finery to fool society. Yet as she returned to the house, Rose found herself holding onto that brief moment, the sound of her name in his deep voice, the fleeting vulnerability in his expression, like a talisman against the uncertainty of her future. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and bright, a perfect spring day that seemed to mock the heaviness in Rose's heart. Ladies' maids bustled around her, arranging her hair with white rosebuds, helping her into the magnificent wedding gown of white satin and Brussels lace that had been commissioned at such expense. The Duchess supervised every detail, critical to the last, ensuring that the bride of her only son would not embarrass the family name. "You clean up tolerably well," the Duchess remarked, studying Rose with a critical eye. "The veil will be particularly advantageous. It hides a multitude of flaws." Rose did not respond to the barb, too consumed with her own thoughts to be wounded by the Duchess's casual cruelty. In less than 2 hours, she would be the Marchioness of Thornfield, bound for life to a man who viewed her as an obligation, a duty to be endured. The journey to St. George's in Hanover Square passed in a blur. Rose was dimly aware of the whispers that followed her entrance, the curious glances of the ton who had gathered to witness this most unexpected match. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, refusing to acknowledge the speculation, the pity, the judgment in those aristocratic faces. And then she saw him, waiting at the altar, tall and imposing in his formal attire, his expression remote. He did not smile as she approached on the arm of the Duke, who had grudgingly agreed to give her away in the absence of her own father. He did not meet her eyes as she took her place beside him. His hand, when it took hers, was cool and impersonal. The ceremony proceeded with solemn efficiency. Rose spoke her vows in a clear voice, promising to love and honor a man who had made it clear he wanted neither from her. Zachary's responses were equally steady, if somewhat mechanical. When the time came for him to lift her veil, his movements were precise and controlled, like a man performing a task he had rehearsed but took no pleasure in. And then, for the first time, he looked directly at her face, unveiled and vulnerable before him. Something shifted in his expression, a fleeting surprise quickly masked. The required kiss was brief, a mere brushing of lips, yet Rose felt a strange warmth spread through her at the contact, a treacherous flutter of something that might, in different circumstances, have been hope. The wedding breakfast that followed was an elaborate affair, hosted at the Westmoreland townhouse for 200 of London's elite. Rose stood beside her new husband, accepting congratulations with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes, painfully aware of the whispers that followed them. Poor Thornfield, trapped by his father's foolish charity. She's pretty enough, I suppose, but hardly a suitable match for a future duke. Her father was a gambler who shot himself, you know. Dreadful scandal. Through it all, Zachary maintained a facade of politeness, his hand occasionally resting on the small of her back to guide her through the crowd, his voice coolly correct as he introduced her to the endless parade of aristocrats whose names and faces blurred together in her memory. It was a relief when they finally departed for Thornfield Court, the Marquess's country estate in Kent. The journey was spent mostly in silence, Zachary absorbed in some papers he had brought with him, Rose gazing out at the passing countryside, wondering what awaited her in her new home. Thornfield Court, when they arrived as dusk was falling, took her breath away despite her anxiety. The great house rose majestically from its landscaped grounds, golden stone glowing in the fading light, windows gleaming with welcome. It was far grander than she had imagined, a testament to centuries of wealth and privilege. "Welcome to Thornfield, Lady Thornfield," Zachary said formally as he handed her down from the carriage. The title sounded foreign to her ears. She was no longer Rose Grenville, the disgraced daughter of a suicide. She was a marchioness, mistress of this great estate, wife to the future Duke of Westmoreland. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. The housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, greeted them at the door, along with a line of servants whose curious gazes Rose felt keenly as Zachary introduced her. She summoned a smile, determined to at least appear worthy of her new position, even if she felt like an impostor in her fine clothes and borrowed status. "I have had the blue suite prepared for her ladyship," Mrs. Reynolds informed Zachary, "connecting to your chambers as instructed, my lord." "Thank you, Reynolds," Zachary replied, his tone neutral. "Lady Thornfield will be tired after the journey. Perhaps you could show her to her rooms while I attend to some correspondence." And just like that, he was gone, striding away down a corridor without a backward glance, leaving Rose alone with the housekeeper on her wedding night. Mrs. Reynolds led her through the grand house, pointing out rooms of interest along the way: the music room, the library, the morning room, where, the housekeeper informed her, she would be expected to receive callers and oversee household matters. Rose listened with half an ear, overwhelmed by the grandeur of her surroundings and the enormity of her new responsibilities. The blue suite, when they reached it, was a revelation, a luxurious set of rooms decorated in shades of azure and cream, with a canopied bed that could have slept six, a private sitting room with views over the formal gardens, and a dressing room where her new clothes had already been unpacked and arranged. "His lordship had the rooms redecorated for you, my lady," Mrs. Reynolds said, a note of surprise in her voice. The suite had not been used since the old marchioness passed away 15 years ago. Rose turned to her in surprise. "He had it redecorated for me." "Yes, my lady. The instructions came a fortnight ago. New furnishings, new draperies, even fresh paint. His lordship was most specific about the colors." This unexpected gesture confused Rose. Why would a man who resented their marriage go to such trouble for her comfort? It seemed at odds with his distant behavior, his clear desire to keep her at arm's length. After Mrs. Reynolds departed, promising to send up a maid to help her change for dinner, Rose explored her new domain, running her fingers over the fine fabrics, the polished wood, the delicate ornaments that adorned the mantelpiece. It was all so beautiful, so carefully arranged, yet she felt like a visitor in a museum, afraid to disturb anything lest she reveal herself as the impostor she was. A discreet door in the wall of her bedchamber, she discovered, led to Zachary's rooms. It was closed, possibly locked, a physical manifestation of the barrier between them. Rose turned away from it, unwilling to contemplate what might or might not happen on this, their wedding night. Dinner was a strained affair, served in a dining room that could have accommodated 50 but held only 2. Zachary made polite conversation about the estate, the local gentry she would be expected to receive, the responsibilities that would fall to her as the marchioness. Not once did he mention their personal relationship or the fact that they were now bound together for life. It was as though he were briefing a new housekeeper rather than addressing his bride. "I thought perhaps tomorrow I might show you the gardens," he said as they finished the final course. "The roses should be in full bloom, and I believe you mentioned having an interest in horticulture." Rose looked up in surprise. She had indeed mentioned a fondness for gardening, but only in passing to the Duchess weeks ago. She hadn't imagined Zachary would have paid attention to such a detail, much less remembered it. "I would like that very much," she replied cautiously. He nodded, then set down his napkin and rose. "I have some correspondence to finish this evening. If you'll excuse me, I'll bid you good night." "Good night, Zachary," she said softly, watching as he left the room without another word. Rose remained at the table for a few moments, the silence of the grand house pressing in around her. Then, gathering her courage, she made her way back to her suite, where she found a young maid waiting to help her prepare for bed. The girl, Jenny, she introduced herself, chattered nervously as she helped Rose out of her dinner gown and into a night dress of fine lawn trimmed with lace, another new addition to her wardrobe. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but everyone's ever so curious about you," Jenny confided as she brushed out Rose's long auburn hair. "We've not had a marchioness at Thornfield since his lordship was a boy, and never expected him to marry at all. What with?" she broke off suddenly, looking mortified. "What with what, Jenny?" Rose prompted gently. The maid bit her lip. "It's not my place to say, my lady." "Please," Rose urged. "I'm new here, and I know so little about my husband. Anything you can tell me would be helpful." Jenny glanced nervously at the door before leaning closer. "Well, there was a lady, you see, Lady Caroline Hartley. Everyone thought his lordship would marry her. They were childhood friends, and last season it seemed certain there would be an announcement. But then something happened, no one knows exactly what, and suddenly Lady Caroline was engaged to the Earl of Devonshire instead. His lordship hasn't been the same since. Hardly smiles anymore, spends all his time working on the estate or shut up in his study." This unexpected information gave Rose pause. Had Zachary loved this Lady Caroline? Was that why he resented their marriage so deeply, because it had cost him a chance at love with a woman of his own choosing? "Thank you, Jenny," she said quietly. "You've been very helpful." After the maid departed, Rose sat before the mirror, staring at her reflection in the soft candlelight. She had never considered herself a beauty. Her features were too strong, her coloring too vivid for the fashionable pallor admired by society. But she was not unpleasing to look at, with her clear grey eyes and the high cheekbones that were her one undeniable claim to distinction. Would Zachary come to her tonight? The thought sent a flutter of nervousness through her stomach. She had been raised to understand the duties of a wife, the necessity of providing an heir. But the idea of intimacy with a man who clearly found her presence an imposition was daunting. As the clock in the corridor struck midnight, Rose finally accepted that he would not come, whether out of consideration for her feelings or simply because he could not bear the thought of touching her. He had chosen to postpone that particular duty. Relief mingled with an unexpected pang of disappointment as she climbed into the enormous bed, the fine sheets cool against her skin. She was a married woman now, yet she lay alone on her wedding night, as distant from her husband as if an ocean separated them instead of a single door. As she drifted towards sleep, Rose wondered if this was to be the pattern of their marriage: polite distance by day, complete separation by night. Two strangers bound by law, but divided by circumstances beyond their control. The weeks that followed fell into a routine of sorts. Each morning, Rose would breakfast alone in her sitting room, then meet with Mrs. Reynolds to discuss household matters. She learned the rhythms of Thornfield Court, the names and duties of the servants, the complexities of managing such a grand establishment. She began to receive callers, neighboring gentry curious about the Marquess's unexpected bride, and to return their visits always accompanied by the housekeeper or one of the more senior maids as propriety demanded. Zachary remained an enigma. He was unfailingly polite, escorting her on rides around the estate, dining with her each evening, introducing her to the local society with every appearance of pride. Yet there remained a wall between them, an invisible barrier he seemed determined to maintain. He never touched her except when absolutely necessary for appearances, never sought out her company for its own sake, never shared his thoughts beyond the most superficial conversation. And he never came to her room at night. 1 month into their marriage, Rose sat in the library, a book open but unread in her lap, as she gazed out at the rain streaking the windows. The weather matched her mood, grey, unsettled, with no sign of clearing. The door opened, startling her from her reverie. Zachary entered, pausing when he saw her. "Forgive me, I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't," she assured him quickly. "I was just reading." She held up the book as evidence, though in truth she hadn't absorbed a word of it. He hesitated, then moved further into the room. "I came to inform you that we have received an invitation to Lady Hartley's summer ball next week. As Caroline's engagement to Devonshire is to be formally announced, our attendance would be expected." Rose felt a chill at the mention of Lady Caroline. "Of course," she said carefully. "If you wish to attend, I shall be happy to accompany you." Zachary's expression tightened. "It is not a question of what I wish. It is a matter of social obligation." "I see." Rose closed her book and set it aside, gathering her courage to ask the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "Zachary, may I speak frankly?" He looked wary but nodded. "If you wish." "Were you in love with Lady Caroline?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and volatile. Zachary's face went completely still, his green eyes hardening. "That is hardly an appropriate topic of conversation," he said coldly. "Perhaps not," Rose agreed, "but I believe I have a right to know. If I am to face this woman at her engagement ball, to watch you in her presence, I should at least understand what she meant to you." For a moment, she thought he would refuse to answer, would retreat behind the wall of formality he had constructed between them. Then, to her surprise, he moved to the window, his back to her as he spoke. "Caroline and I grew up together. Our estates adjoin, and our mothers were close friends. It was always assumed that we would marry. Last season, I was on the verge of proposing when," he trailed off, his shoulders tense, "when I discovered her in a compromising position with Devonshire at Lady Winchester's ball." Rose's hand flew to her mouth in shock. "Oh, Zachary." "I confronted her privately. She admitted that while she was fond of me, she had fallen in love with Devonshire. She begged me to release her from our understanding, informal though it was." His voice was flat, emotionless, as though he were recounting events that had happened to someone else. "I agreed, of course. What else could I do? Force a woman to marry me who clearly loved another?" Now Rose understood. His reluctance to marry her wasn't just about her father's disgrace or the forced nature of their arrangement. It was about a heart still wounded by betrayal, a man who had offered love only to have it rejected. "I'm sorry," she said softly, meaning it. "That must have been very painful." He turned to face her, his expression guarded. "It was a valuable lesson. Sentiment is a luxury that rarely serves a practical purpose. Our marriage, at least, is founded on reality rather than romantic illusion." The words strung, reminding Rose of her place in his life. A duty, an obligation, nothing more. "Yes," she agreed quietly. "Very practical indeed." Zachary studied her for a moment, as though seeing something in her face that troubled him. "I have upset you. That was not my intention." "No, you've merely been honest. I appreciate that." She rose from her seat, suddenly unable to bear his presence a moment longer. "If you'll excuse me, I should change before dinner." She walked past him, keeping her back straight, her dignity intact, though inside she felt as though something fragile had shattered. She had begun, against all reason, to hope that perhaps, with time, they might forge some kind of genuine connection. But how could they, when he had closed his heart so completely against the possibility of love? The night of Lady Hartley's ball arrived, and with it, Rose's first real test as the Marquess of Thornfield. She stood before the mirror in her dressing room, studying her reflection with a critical eye. Her gown was the finest she had ever worn, a creation of deep emerald silk that set off the auburn highlights in her dark hair and complemented her pale skin. Diamonds, Barrington family heirlooms that Zachary had silently presented to her earlier that evening, glittered at her throat and ears. She looked every inch the aristocrat's wife, yet inside she felt like that same uncertain girl who had arrived at the Westmoreland townhouse months ago, painfully aware of her inadequacies. Zachary was waiting for her at the foot of the grand staircase, resplendent in formal evening attire. For a brief moment as she descended, she caught an expression on his face that looked almost like admiration, but it was quickly replaced by his usual mask of polite detachment. "You look very well," he said, offering his arm. "The emeralds suit you." "Thank you," she replied, placing her hand lightly on his sleeve. "You're very kind." He frowned slightly at that. "It is not kindness to state a fact, Rose." The carriage ride to Hartley Manor was conducted mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Rose could feel Zachary's tension increasing as they approached their destination, his body rigid beside her in the darkness. "You need not fear that I shall embarrass you," she said softly. "I have been well schooled in the proprieties by your mother." Zachary turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I have never once worried that you would embarrass me, Rose. You have conducted yourself with perfect dignity since our marriage, despite difficult circumstances." The unexpected praise warmed her. "Thank you." "It is not I who will be under scrutiny tonight," he continued, his voice taking on an edge. "The ton can be merciless to those they consider outsiders. If anyone should treat you with less than perfect respect, you will inform me immediately." Rose was touched by this protective impulse, small though it was. "I can manage a few snubs, Zachary. I'm stronger than I look." "Yes," he said after a pause, "I believe you are." Hartley Manor was ablaze with light. Carriages lined up along the curved driveway as the cream of county society arrived for what promised to be the social event of the season. Rose felt the curious stares as they entered, heard the whispers that followed them through the crowded ballroom. She kept her head high, her hand resting lightly on Zachary's arm, determined not to give the gossips the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. Lady Hartley, a handsome woman of middle years, greeted them with obvious surprise. "Thornfield, I hardly expected you to attend, and this must be your bride. How lovely to meet you, my dear." Rose curtsied gracefully. "The pleasure is mine, Lady Hartley. Your home is beautiful." "Thank you." Lady Hartley's gaze shifted between them, clearly looking for signs of discord or unhappiness. Finding none, she seemed almost disappointed. "Caroline will be so pleased you could come. She's with Lord Devonshire, of course. I believe they're in the music room." Zachary's arm tensed beneath Rose's hand, but his expression remained impassive. "We shall be sure to offer our congratulations." They moved away, Zachary securing champagne for them both from a passing footman. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, his tone suggesting it was a duty rather than a pleasure. "I would be delighted," Rose replied, determined to make the best of the evening despite the undercurrents of tension she could feel swirling around them. As he led her onto the dance floor, Rose was acutely aware of the speculation their appearance had generated. Most of these people had expected Zachary to marry Lady Caroline Hartley. Instead, he had returned from London with a bride no one had heard of, the daughter of a disgraced gentleman. It was catnip to the gossips. To her surprise, Zachary proved to be an excellent dancer, leading her through the complex patterns of the waltz with effortless grace. For the first time, she was conscious of him as a physical presence, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the scent of his cologne, the surprising strength in the arms that guided her. It was unsettling. "You dance very well," he remarked as they circled the floor. "My mother insisted on dancing lessons, even when we could ill afford them," she replied, looking up at him. "She said a lady should always know how to conduct herself in society, regardless of circumstances." Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She is." "I hope you'll meet her someday." Rose had written to her mother regularly since their marriage, but Zachary had shown no interest in visiting the cottage where Mrs. Grenville was comfortably established on the far side of the Westmoreland estate. "Perhaps that could be arranged," he said, surprising her. When we return to London for the season, she might join us for a time. The idea of her mother visiting them in London, of Zachary showing even this small consideration for her family, touched Rose deeply. She would like that very much, as would I. As the waltz ended, Rose became aware of a striking blonde woman watching them from the edge of the dance floor, her arm linked with that of a handsome, dark-haired man in his 30s. The woman's gaze was fixed on Zachary with an intensity that made Rose's skin prickle with awareness. "Lady Caroline, I presume," she murmured as Zachary led her from the floor. He followed her gaze, his expression tightening. "Yes, she's very beautiful." "Yes," he agreed curtly. "Shall we offer our congratulations?" Rose suggested, knowing the encounter was inevitable and preferring to face it on her own terms. Zachary hesitated, then nodded sharply. "If we must." As they approached, Lady Caroline's perfect features arranged themselves into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Zachary, how wonderful to see you, and this must be your bride. We were all so surprised when we heard the news." "Lady Caroline," Zachary acknowledged stiffly. "Allow me to present my wife, Lady Thornfield. Rose, this is Lady Caroline Hartley and the Earl of Devonshire." Rose curtsied, studying the woman who had broken Zachary's heart. She was everything Rose was not. Fair where Rose was dark, delicate where Rose was tall, her features arranged in perfect symmetry that conformed to society's ideal of beauty. Yet there was something calculating in her blue eyes, a coldness beneath the polished exterior. "We were so sorry to miss your wedding," Lady Caroline continued, her gaze flicking dismissively over Rose before returning to Zachary. "It all happened so quickly, didn't it? One would almost think there was a need for haste." Her implication was clear, that Rose had trapped Zachary into marriage through some impropriety. Before Rose could respond, Zachary's hand came to rest possessively at the small of her back. "When one is fortunate enough to find the right partner, Lady Caroline, there seems little reason to delay," he said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "Just as you and Devonshire apparently discovered." The Earl, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward with a rueful smile. "Well said, Thornfield, and may I offer my congratulations on your marriage. Your bride is charming." "Thank you, Devonshire," Zachary replied, his tone marginally warmer. "And allow me to congratulate you both on your engagement. I wish you every happiness." It was graciously said, but Rose could feel the tension radiating from him. She placed her hand on his arm, a silent gesture of support that he acknowledged with a brief glance. "How did you two meet?" Lady Caroline asked Rose directly, her smile not quite masking the gleam of curiosity or perhaps malice in her eyes. It must be quite the romantic tale to have resulted in such a precipitous union. Rose met her gaze steadily. "I'm afraid there's nothing particularly romantic about our meeting, Lady Caroline. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns, and we find happiness where we least expect it." Lady Caroline's smile faltered slightly at this diplomatic non-answer. "How philosophical of you. And how are you finding life at Thornfield Court? It must be quite a change from wherever it is you're from." "Hampshire," Rose supplied calmly. "And yes, Thornfield is magnificent. Zachary has been most attentive in helping me adjust to my new role." She allowed herself to lean slightly against him, playing the part of the besotted bride. "I couldn't ask for a more considerate husband." Zachary's arm tightened almost imperceptibly around her waist, whether in warning or approval, she couldn't tell. "If you'll excuse us," he said smoothly, "I believe this next dance is beginning, and I've promised it to my wife." As they moved away, Rose felt Lady Caroline's eyes boring into her back. "I don't think she expected to find us so united," she murmured. "No," Zachary agreed, his voice tight. "I expect she thought to find me miserable and you out of your depth." "And are you?" "Miserable, I mean." He glanced down at her, something unreadable flickering in his green eyes. "Not at the moment, no." It was hardly a declaration of contentment, but it was perhaps the most positive thing he had said about their marriage thus far. Rose counted it as progress. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of dances, conversations, and careful navigation of social currents. Rose found herself the object of intense scrutiny, but with Zachary at her side, appearing every inch the attentive husband, the worst of the gossip seemed to be held at bay. It was past midnight when they finally took their leave, both tired from the strain of maintaining appearances. In the privacy of their carriage, Rose allowed herself to relax, leaning back against the cushions with a soft sigh. "You acquitted yourself admirably tonight," Zachary said after a long silence. "Many women would have wilted under such scrutiny." "Thank you," Rose replied, surprised by the compliment. "I'm glad I didn't embarrass you. As I told you earlier, that was never my concern." He hesitated, then added, "You handled Caroline with particular grace. She was deliberately provocative." Rose shrugged slightly. "She wanted to see if she still had the power to hurt you, and perhaps to hurt me in the process." "And did she succeed?" Zachary asked, his voice carefully neutral. "In hurting you?" Rose considered the question. "No," she said finally. "One cannot be hurt by the disdain of someone whose opinion one does not value." A short laugh escaped him, seemingly despite himself. "Diplomatically put." "I was raised to be polite, even about those I dislike," Rose replied with a small smile. They lapsed into silence again, but it was more comfortable than before, the shared experience of the evening having created a fragile bond between them. As they neared Thornfield Court, Rose found herself reluctant for the night to end, for them to retreat once more behind the walls of formality that had defined their marriage thus far. "Thank you for defending me tonight," she said softly as the carriage turned onto the long drive leading to the house. "When Lady Caroline implied that there was some impropriety that led to our marriage." Zachary's expression hardened. "I would not allow anyone to impugn your honor, Rose. Whatever the circumstances of our marriage, you have conducted yourself with nothing but dignity and propriety. Still, it was kind of you." "It was not kindness," he insisted, echoing his words from earlier in the evening. "Merely what any husband would do." But they both knew that wasn't true. Their marriage was not like others, founded as it was on obligation rather than affection. That he had chosen to defend her, to present a united front to society, was a choice, not a duty. When they reached the house, Zachary escorted her to her rooms as he did every night, bidding her a formal good night at her door. But tonight, as she turned to enter her bedchamber, he surprised her by catching her hand. "Rose." She looked back at him, startled by the contact and the uncertainty in his voice. "You asked me earlier if I was miserable," he said quietly. "The truth is, I expected to be. I entered this marriage with resentment and resignation. But you have surprised me. Your grace under pressure, your dignity in difficult circumstances, your kindness to the servants and tenants, these are qualities that command respect." Rose hardly dared breathe, afraid that any movement might break this fragile moment of honesty between them. "I cannot offer you the kind of marriage I know you deserve," he continued, his eyes searching hers. "But I want you to know that I do not regret our union as I once did, and I hope that, in time, we might find a way to be comfortable with one another." It was not a declaration of love or even of affection, but from a man who had sworn that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford, it was a significant concession. "I would like that," Rose replied softly. "Very much." He nodded once, then released her hand and stepped back. "Good night, then." "Good night, Zachary." As she closed the door behind her, Rose leaned against it, her heart beating rapidly in her chest. It was a small step, a tiny crack in the wall that separated them. But it was a beginning, and for tonight, that was enough. The weeks following the Hartley ball brought subtle but significant changes to the dynamics of their marriage. Zachary began to seek out Rose's company, inviting her to ride with him in the mornings, asking her opinion on improvements to the estate. even sharing books from the library that he thought might interest her. The wall between them hadn't fallen, but it had developed doorways through which they cautiously began to know one another. One rainy afternoon found them in the library, Rose curled in a window seat with a novel while Zachary reviewed estate accounts at his desk. The comfortable silence between them was broken only by the patter of rain against the windows and the occasional turning of a page. "What are you reading?" Zachary asked suddenly, looking up from his work. Rose showed him the cover. "Sense and Sensibility. It was in the box of books you had sent up to my rooms last week." A smile touched his lips. "Ah, Miss Austen, my mother was fond of her novels, though my father considered them frivolous." "And what do you think of them?" Rose asked curiously. "I find her observations of human nature to be remarkably astute, if sometimes uncomfortably so." He set aside his pen and turned more fully toward her. "Do you prefer Eleanor's sense or Marian's sensibility?" Rose considered the question seriously. "I admire Eleanor's strength and self-discipline, but I can understand Marian's desire for passion and romance. I suppose the ideal would be a balance between the two, enough sense to guide one's actions, but enough sensibility to fully experience life's joys and sorrows." Zachary studied her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "A thoughtful answer. I believe Miss Austen might agree with you." "And you," Rose ventured, "are you all sense, like Eleanor, or is there perhaps a touch of Marian's sensibility hidden beneath that practical exterior?" It was a more personal question than she would have dared ask even a week ago. For a moment she feared she had overstepped, but then Zachary's lips curved in a rueful smile. "I was raised to value sense above all else. Duty, responsibility, practical considerations, these were the principles my father instilled in me from boyhood." He paused, his gaze drifting to the rain-streaked window. "But yes, there was a time when I allowed sensibility to guide me. It did not end well." He was speaking of Caroline, Rose realized, of the hurt and betrayal that had led him to close his heart against sentiment. "Perhaps the fault was not in the sensibility itself," she suggested gently, "but in the object upon which it was bestowed." Zachary's gaze returned to her face, his expression thoughtful. "An interesting perspective. I shall have to consider it." The conversation moved on to other topics, books they had read, places they had visited, memories of childhood, but something had shifted between them. A door had opened, allowing a glimpse of the man behind the Marquess's formal facade. That night, as Rose prepared for bed, a knock sounded at the door that connected her bedchamber to Zachary's. Her heart leapt into her throat as she called, "Come in." Zachary entered, dressed in a dressing gown over his nightclothes, his expression uncertain. "I apologize for disturbing you, but I wanted to give you this." He held out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Rose accepted it with surprise. "What is it?" "Open it and see." She unwrapped the tissue to reveal a small, leather-bound book of poetry. "Wordsworth," she said, running her fingers over the embossed title. "You mentioned today that you enjoyed his work, but had never owned a copy," Zachary explained. "I remembered that there was a first edition in the library that rarely sees use. I thought you might like to have it." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Rose deeply. "Thank you, it's a beautiful gift." "It's a small thing," he demurred, but seemed pleased by her reaction. He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about the balance between sense and sensibility. I believe you may be right. Either quality, taken to an extreme, can lead to unhappiness." "Yes," Rose agreed, wondering where this conversation was leading. Zachary took a step closer, his green eyes intent on her face. "Our marriage was founded on sense, practical considerations, duty, responsibility. And while I still believe those are important foundations, perhaps there is room for other considerations as well." Rose's breath caught. "What sort of considerations?" "Companionship, understanding, perhaps even affection in time." The words seemed difficult for him to say, as though he were venturing onto uncertain ground. If you were amenable to such a development. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was an opening, an invitation to transform their marriage of convenience into something more meaningful. Rose felt a surge of hope, fragile but real. I would be very amenable, she said softly. Zachary nodded, relief evident in his expression. Good, that's good. He took a step back, maintaining the physical distance between them even as the emotional distance had begun to close. I'll bid you good night, then. Good night, Zachary. After he had gone, Rose held the book of poetry to her chest, a smile curving her lips. It was a beginning, tentative and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. As summer gave way to autumn, the relationship between Rose and Zachary continued to evolve. They established routines that brought them together naturally throughout the day. Breakfast in the morning room, rides through the estate, evenings spent reading in the library or playing chess, a game Rose had never mastered, but enjoyed for the opportunity it provided for conversation. They began to receive visitors, local gentry and neighbors curious about the Marquess's bride. To Rose's surprise, Zachary seemed proud to present her as his wife, attentive to her comfort and quick to highlight her accomplishments when conversation allowed. If anyone noticed that the marriage was still unconsummated, that the Marchioness's apartments remained her primary sleeping quarters, they were too polite or too intimidated by the Marquess's forbidding demeanor toward gossip to mention it. One crisp October morning, Rose was in the conservatory, selecting flowers for the arrangements that would grace the dinner table that evening, when Mrs. Reynolds appeared with a message. His lordship requests your presence in the east wing, my lady. He says it's a matter of some importance. Curious, Rose followed the housekeeper through corridors she had rarely visited. The east wing of Thornfield Court was older than the rest of the house, dating back to Tudor times, and had fallen into disuse over the years. Zachary had mentioned plans to renovate it eventually, but as far as Rose knew, those plans had not yet been put into action. She found him in a large, dust-covered room with tall windows that let in streams of autumn sunlight. The space was empty save for a few pieces of furniture draped in Holland covers and a collection of paintings stacked against one wall. Zachary, Mrs. Reynolds said you wanted to see me. He turned at the sound of her voice, a rare smile lighting his features. Yes, I've been thinking about your suggestion that the house needs a music room. This space was originally built as one before my grandfather had the newer music room created in the West Wing. I thought perhaps we might restore it to its original purpose. Rose moved further into the room, trying to envision it transformed. It has wonderful light, and the proportions are perfect for music, high ceilings for good acoustics. My thoughts exactly. And there's something else. Zachary moved to one of the Holland-covered shapes and pulled away the protective cloth to reveal a pianoforte. This belonged to my mother. It's been in storage since her death, but I thought perhaps you might like to have it restored for your use. Rose approached the instrument with reverence. It was a beautiful piece, crafted of rosewood with inlaid detail along the sides. Zachary, it's exquisite. Are you certain you wish to part with it? I'm not parting with it, he corrected gently. I'm entrusting it to someone who will appreciate it as she did. You mentioned that you played, but haven't had access to an instrument since your father's death. The fact that he had remembered this casual mention, made weeks ago during one of their evening conversations, touched her deeply. Thank you, this means a great deal to me. There's more, Zachary said, seeming almost nervous now. I've been corresponding with your mother. She's agreed to come to Thornfield for Christmas if you would like that. Rose stared at him in astonishment. You've been writing to my mother? Yes, I thought it was time I made her acquaintance, as she is now my family as well. He hesitated, studying her face. Have I overstepped? No, Rose assured him quickly. No, not at all. I'm just surprised and pleased, very pleased. Zachary's expression softened. Good. I want you to be happy here, Rose. I know our marriage began under difficult circumstances, but I find myself increasingly grateful for the twist of fate that brought you into my life. It was the closest he had come to expressing genuine affection for her. Rose felt a warmth spread through her chest, a hope that had been quietly growing these past months. As am I, she said softly. They stood in silence for a moment, the dust motes dancing in the sunlight around them, the air heavy with unspoken feelings. There's one more thing, Zachary said finally, a question I've been meaning to ask you. Yes. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. Would you consider moving your belongings to our shared chambers? The connecting door between our rooms seems unnecessary now. Rose's heart began to race. Are you asking me to share your bed, Zachary? I'm asking you to share my life, he replied, his voice low and sincere. In all ways, if you are willing. The months of growing friendship, of mutual respect and cautious affection, had led to this moment. Rose realized that somewhere along the way, without quite noticing when it had happened, she had fallen in love with her husband. Not with the Marquess, the aristocrat, the future duke, but with Zachary, the man who remembered small details about her preferences, who defended her against society's cruelty, who had slowly opened himself to the possibility of caring for her. I am willing, she said simply, more than willing. His hand came up to cup her cheek, the first truly intimate touch they had shared since their brief wedding kiss. You have changed me, Rose. When we met, I believed that love was a luxury I could not afford. That sentiment led only to pain. You have shown me otherwise, with your grace, your courage, your kindness. And you have changed me, she replied, leaning slightly into his touch. I thought myself trapped in a loveless marriage, forced to sacrifice happiness for security. Instead, I have found something I never expected, a partner, a friend, perhaps even. A lover, he finished for her, his thumb gently brushing her lower lip. If you will have me. Instead of answering with words, Rose rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. Unlike their wedding kiss, this was no mere formality. It was a beginning, a promise, a declaration of feelings too new and fragile to be fully expressed in words. When they broke apart, Zachary rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. I should have done that months ago, he murmured. Rose smiled, her heart full to bursting. We have time, she reminded him. All the time in the world. That night, for the first time, Rose entered Zachary's bedchamber not as a visitor, but as a wife. Their coming together was tender, respectful, a physical expression of the emotional bond that had been growing between them. And afterward, as she lay in his arms, Rose marveled at the strange twist of fate that had brought them together, an arrangement neither had wanted, yet which had somehow transformed into something precious and real. What are you thinking? Zachary asked, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. I'm thinking about beginnings, she replied, how the darkest moments can sometimes lead to unexpected light. He pressed a kiss to her temple. When my father first proposed this match, I was furious. I saw it as a punishment, a burden I was being forced to bear for his misplaced sense of charity. And now, Rose prompted when he fell silent. Now I understand that it was the greatest gift he could have given me. Zachary shifted so that he could see her face in the dim light of the bedside candle. I love you, Rose. Not out of duty or obligation, but simply because you are who you are, brave and kind and honest and true. Tears pricked at Rose's eyes. I love you too, Zachary, with all my heart. As he kissed her again, more deeply this time, Rose reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From strangers bound by circumstance to lovers united by choice. From an arrangement of convenience to a true marriage. And as Zachary extinguished the candle, drawing her once more into his embrace, Rose offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the unwanted marriage that had, against all odds, blossomed into love.